We're in chapter 24, and the first 9 verses basically deal with the Jews coming down from, that is, the heights of Jerusalem to Caesarea to make their charges against the Apostle Paul. They've already done everything they could to try and attack him and even plotted to murder him. And they bring with them a lawyer named Tertullus. Tertullus was a Roman, obviously, from his name, and also they would need a lawyer that understood Roman law to present their case before Felix. And that brings us down to verse 10, and we're going to get to see Paul's response to the charges that has been made against him. Notice in verse 10, Then Paul, after that the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, Forasmuch as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. Notice the difference in the words that Paul used compared to those that Tertullus. Tertullus's words were full of this sweetness and I'm going to flatter you. That's not the way Paul has addressed him. He just simply states some facts. And he says, well, you've been a judge for many years. Well, if memory serves me right, he had already been a judge now in Judea for 6 years, and he had been a judge in Cilicia, and I've forgotten how many years before that. I do the more cheerfully, he says, answer for myself. Normally, a judge would warn somebody, you're a fool to answer for yourself, get a lawyer. At least in our time, that's the way it is. Apparently, then it was a little different in some of the reading that I've done, and yet in other cases they needed somebody who really understood the law to take care of their position. But Paul says, I'm going to answer for myself. And why does he answer for himself? Because he knew that Felix understood the Jews' laws and their traditions. He had been involved in that area for so long, or long enough, that he had learned just exactly how the Jews operated. And so Paul proceeds to answer 3 charges which have been made against him by Tertullus and these Jews. First of all was the charge that he disturbed the peace. He's going to answer that in verses 11 through 13. Second was the charge that he was the head of the sect of the Nazarenes, verses 14 through 16. And finally, the charge that he had profaned the temple, verses 17 through 19. Excuse me. These were serious charges if they were true, but they were all lies. Look at verses 11 through 13 where he answers the first charge. Because that thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem for to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogues nor in the city. Neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. So notice that as a part of his defense, Paul is going to appeal to the time factor. He's going to lay out the time from the time that he got to Jerusalem to the time that he presented or was presented before Felix. He says, first of all, it's only been 12 days. As an idea of there hasn't been enough time for me to do what they said that I was doing. And I want to show you, Felix, a day by day what took place. First of all, on day 1, he arrived in Jerusalem. That's chapter 21 and verse 17. Secondly, he met with James and the elders, and now that's day 2, Acts 21:18. And then there's the 7 days of purification. Some thought, oh, well, that was 3 to 9 days, but in Acts 21 and verse 27. But notice something that Paul says in our context in verse 18. Paul said that they had found him purified. In other words, he had gone through the entire ritual time of this purification. And so it would be 3 to 9 days. No, not 3. It's going to be the total of 9 days, or the 9th day when that was finished. Notice then in chapter 21 and verse 30 and 31, he now talks about the 9th day, what took place on that day. The Jews tried to kill Paul in the temple. That's the first attempt they made to kill him, by dragging him out. And remember, the original words show us that they meant extreme bodily harm to him, probably killing. And then notice that Lysias took Paul before the council. That was on day 10, Acts 22 and verse 30. And then in Acts 23 and verse 11, day 11, the Lord appeared to Paul and assured him, you're going to Rome. Don't you worry about what they're doing. Don't you worry about what may happen. You're going to Rome, Paul. And then the 12th day, we see the plot to kill Paul. The report that was sent to Lysias and the execution of moving Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea. So 12 days have taken place. And not just 12 days where any old thing could have happened, 12 days of specific things happening. I didn't have time. I was too busy taking care of some other things. So he arrived in Caesarea on day 12. So 12 days that are alluded to here comprise when he arrived in Jerusalem from the time he was delivered to Caesarea and Felix. Now, Tertullus and the Jews arrived 5 days later, according to our context, to accuse Paul. So that would be 17 days after he had arrived in Jerusalem to the time that they arrived to accuse him and try to get Felix to scourge him at the very least, I believe, and put him to death at the very most. So let's ask the question. Considering that time frame, why did Paul go to Jerusalem in the first place? Well, again, the text gives us the answer. In verse 11, he says, I went to worship. Paul says, I didn't go up to start a riot. I didn't go up to start some sedition. I went up to worship. Oh, and by the way, I went up for a second reason too. That's found in verse 17. I came to bring alms to my nation. He came to bring gifts to his nation, gifts to the poor brethren and what they were going through. We maybe should need to remember that when a Jew obeyed Christ in that century, he would now be ostracized. It is said that even today, the Hasidim Jews, the strictest form of the Jews today, if you die, if you were their son, if you were their mother, and you turned and went to Christianity, and they have a funeral service, they bury an empty coffin, you can be there and they won't even acknowledge you as being alive. That's how strict it was. You're going to lose your business opportunities and contacts. You're going to lose it all. That was the Jews' way of trying to shame someone to fall in line with the religion of Judaism. Notice, Paul hadn't gone up to Jerusalem to start a disturbance. And indirectly, Paul is making an accusation against these Jews. An accusation that they're the ones who started the disturbance in the first place. Lying about him, lying about who started things, lying about what he had done. Paul said in verse 12, "Neither in the temple did they find me disputing with any man." Notice this. Here's another objection that he makes. They didn't find me in the temple even having an argument with someone. They didn't find me trying to persuade anyone. They simply found me in the temple worshiping, not causing any kind of a problem. Next, he also says, they didn't find me stirring up the crowd. They just simply found me worshiping. They found me as one who brought alms to my nation. They didn't find me on a corner of the temple somewhere and shouting and trying to cause people to say, "Hey, you got to do this, you got to do that," etc., stirring them up, like that old Egyptian that Lysias had originally thought he was. And notice, he hadn't disputed with or stirred anyone up in the synagogue, but he also then clarifies and adds something to it. And you didn't find me doing that in the city when I was in the city. When he was traveling back and forth to the temple on those days of purification. If he even left the temple area, we don't know that for sure. But while he was in the city, those times when he was in the city, when he got there day one, when he's talking with the apostle James, to James and the elders. When I was in the city, I wasn't stirring up a problem. It can also be equally stated that Paul, when he became a Christian, he had never been a troublemaker anywhere that he went. That is, after he became a Christian. He never was a troublemaker. It was always the Jews who were causing the problem. It was always Gentiles that were causing the problem. He just simply presented God's truth. Now, today, people will tell us, "Oh, you're just trying to cause trouble because you stand for what God says." No, that's not the troublemaker. The troublemaker is the one who wants to go against what God says. Now, it is the case that we can act in an ugly manner and therefore actually be accused, rightfully so, of being a troublemaker. But that wasn't the case with Paul. He wasn't acting ugly. He wasn't setting about intentionally to cause problems. During the first several centuries, there were a number of people who thought there was some kind of, a lot like Islam, that if I die a martyr, I'm going to be, I'm going to have everything made. And they had this idea, some Christians did. And so they would go out of their way to trouble people, to cause a problem, and then they could say, "Well, I've been persecuted." Have you ever seen anybody like that today? I've seen members of the Lord's church today try to do exactly that same thing, try to cause a problem just so that later they can walk away and tell their close associates, "Oh, I was so persecuted. Poor things." As a Christian, we have to simply teach what God tells us to teach. Let the chips fall where they may. In a court of law, it has always been the obligation of the accuser to prove his accusations. They couldn't prove any of these things. Paul let that be known. Look, I'm on the defense here. I don't have to prove that I'm innocent. In fact, the opposition has to prove that I'm guilty. They have to prove their accusations. Consider here a false doctrine that has been advocated, and sometimes even by Christians today. It's the false doctrine that says everything a Christian does is worship. I want you to think about that in connection with this passage. And also think about it from other passages that you may think of. But look at Acts 24 and verse 11. Seeing that thou canst take knowledge that it is not something wrong either with my eyes or yet. Because that thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem for to worship. Do you see anything in there that'll help you to understand that everything we do is not worship? You see, worship is an attitude, isn't it? In verse 20, it's worship is an attitude which they say envelops 24/7. Everything you do is worship. Wait a minute. This text doesn't say that. Worship is defined in this verse as an activity. It's not defined as an attitude. It's not defined as a feeling. It's not defined as an emotion. Worship is defined as an activity. Not just an activity, but an activity where a specific decision has been engaged in, that I'm going to engage in a particular act of homage to God. It's not a feeling. It's not an emotion. It's not everything we do. The Bible defines worship as an activity that I have determined to do in order to bring homage to my God. And it's so easy to consider a whole bunch of things that we could say, well, is this worship? I mean, how silly some things are. Oh, I'm out on a soccer field and I'm playing soccer and I'm worshiping God. No, you better be acting like a Christian should act, but you're not involved in a case of worship. Or playing basketball, or we could go to even far more ridiculous things to show everything we do is not worship. Look at verse 14. But this I confess unto thee. Paul's going to admit something to the judge. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing in all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. Felix, I want to confess something to you. He said, here's what I do. The word confess here means to acknowledge. Strong tells us, and Thayer tells us it's the word concede. Felix, I want to confess, I want to acknowledge something to you. I want to concede something to thee that I do. These Jewish leaders may have gotten their ears perked up a little bit right about this time. He's going to confess something. Question is he going to confess something that is evil, that he's done something evil? Because that's the way man tends to think about the word confess, isn't it? If I'm going to concede that I've been doing something, it's usually because a charge has been brought against me and I'm going to, I did it. But Paul didn't stop there, did he? Paul said he was guilty of being a part of what these Jews and Tertullius called heresy. Haeresis. Properly, a choice. I'm guilty of making the choice to follow Christ, just like these Jews said that I did. I made that choice. I left Judaism. I left the law of Moses because I came to understand it's no longer valid. I thus accepted Christianity, which was led to by the law of Moses. Thayer tells us that this word means choosing, choice, that which is chosen. Paul's saying, I made a decision. I made a choice to stop following the law of Moses and to follow Christianity. Therefore, these Jews are right. They want to call it heresy. They want to say that it's something that is more like a sect, the American Standard Version, or Campbell, or the English Standard Version pronounce this. He says, if they want to call it a sect, I'm guilty. I'm following the Christ. But it's not a sect as they label a sect. Notice the words the Spirit chose for Paul to use here. After the way which they call heresy. Did you notice that? The way. And that way has already been shown in the context to signify Christianity. After the way, the only way. Christianity. The only religious way. The ASV and ESV and the ESB all capitalize the word way, and I believe it should be capitalized because it is talking about the only way which brings salvation in religion, Christianity. These Jews were simply saying that Paul chose a way that they did not choose, that they didn't like, and that they believed that anyone who chose that way deserved to be put to death. Well, let's ask a question. Just because someone says someone does something, does that mean that that's the way it is? Or that they are something, that that's the way it is? A rose can be called a turnip, green anytime you want to, but it doesn't take away from the fact that it's still a rose. You can taste that rose, you can eat the pebble, but I guarantee it isn't going to taste like a collard greens or turnip greens. It's not the same. You can call it anybody anything you want to. And in this last political season, I just stop and think about the things people have been calling each other. And almost none of them have any truth to them. They're exaggerations of some truth that has been said or something of that nature. The fact is, if anyone was guilty of being a follower of a heresy, as the Jews defined it, that is a doctrine contrary to God, it was them. It was Tertullius and those who were with him. So you see, Paul is boldly declaring that there's only one true religion. There's only one. There's not two, there's not 100, there's not 1,000. And secondly, he's declaring boldly that he's not ashamed to be associated with that one true religion. All of humanity needs to learn that Christianity is not, never has been, made up of different parts. Those different parts are decisions that people have made of their own to follow whatever they want to. And therefore those parts are not true religion. There is only one church that God designed. There is only one kingdom that God designed. There aren't any others. And like Paul, you and I need to be people who are willing to sit back and say, when people say, oh, join the church of your choice. Wait a minute, I can't join the church. The Lord's got to add me to the church, according to the Scriptures. Oh, well, it's all right for you to be a part of any religious group that you want to be a part of. No, Jesus only died for one. He didn't die for all of the other ideas that men have. He set forth one doctrine, one church, one kingdom, and man has no right to choose for himself what he wants to do unless he wants to be lost. Paul went on to say, so I worship God. I worship the God, he says, of my fathers. Who were those fathers? It's the same ones that the Jews standing before Felix at this time would have said were their fathers: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In a sense, the founders of Judaism, Israel. The ones who are called the fathers over and over and over in the Old Testament. Paul is basically saying, I never stopped worshiping the same God, the same Father that they say they're worshiping. I never stopped worshiping the God of our fathers, just as they claim to worship. Now, there's something important about that is easy to miss. Under Roman law, it was soon going to be put into legal terms that to worship any religious in any religious organization or any god that had not previously been worshiped, then you were committing a crime that was worthy of death. That was coming. About the time of around, I believe it was around 69, maybe a little before that, that law went into existence. So if you could show that a religion was a new religion, not having any basis at all, now that was the key, not having any basis at all in any religion that went before it, you could be put to death. Paul said, I worship the God of my fathers, implying just like they are worshiping the God of our fathers. He's not saying that Christianity is not different than the law of Moses. No, he's not saying that. But what he is saying is that Christianity is the fulfillment of the law of Moses. The law of Moses was leading to Christianity. The law of Moses was the fulfillment of what our fathers believed and looked forward to. All of the law and the prophets and the Psalms led to this kingdom. Look at Galatians 3:22 through 24 with me for a moment. Notice in that text it says, the Scripture hath concluded all under sin. Why? That the promise by faith of Jesus Christ might be given to them that believe. Abraham was called who? The father of the faithful, wasn't he? The promise by faith of Jesus Christ. That is the fulfillment of all the promises of the Old Testament. The promises that were given by faith. They couldn't see it developed. They didn't understand it totally. They had some understanding. But they knew there was coming a Messiah. And that through Him, that's who the promise was going to be fulfilled in. Notice he goes on. Might be given by them or to them that believe. What? The promise is going to be given to who? To those who believe. Based on what? The law that Jesus brought. But before faith came, the law of Moses, the patriarchal age, primarily the law of Moses, we were kept under the law, shut up under the faith which should afterwards be revealed. In other words, the faith that proclaimed a Messiah is coming, the faith that said that it's for those who believe based on what Jesus has brought to them, it's for them. That's for us today, Christians. Anybody who's lived after the first Pentecost, after Jesus' resurrection, and the establishment of the church kingdom. Watch what he then says. Wherefore, the law was our schoolmaster. That's a very important word. The law was our schoolmaster. Now, in our time, what do we tend to think of a schoolmaster as? A teacher, a principal, an educator. The original word doesn't mean that. A schoolmaster, under the Greek language, was one who brought the student to the teacher. Who's going to be the teacher when this promise, the faith that was promised by faith to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and thus that they were in the patriarchal age, and thus to the Mosaic age? Isn't that interesting? Who's going to be this one? It's going to be the Christ and what He gives. Well, what did the law do? What did this law of promise that was given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, patriarchal age, and then on, and I would suggest to you even to Job, what's it going to do? It's going to lead us to the one who's going to be our teacher. Who was that? God through His Son, Christ. How many times do you see Jesus saying that I didn't say what I wanted to say? I said what the Father told me to say. And then the Holy Spirit, who then guided them into all the apostles and a few other inspired men like Mark and Luke and James and Jude, to guide them into all truth. Why was He, or what was He teaching? Not what I wanted to say, the Spirit said. Jesus said that about Him too. He's not going to teach what He wants to say. He's going to teach what I had to say. Well, where'd you get your teaching from, Jesus? The Father. Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster, to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. There was no justification under the old law, because the sacrifice for justification had not been offered yet. Justification for the old law, for the patriarchal law, only came, or those who followed it as they should, only came when the one who his blood offered the justification. We are justified by faith. What faith? The faith that Jesus told us, proclaimed to us as the Messiah, having to die for you and I. Look at Galatians 4, verses 4 through 5. But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth His Son, made of a woman, made under the law. The entire time that Jesus lived on this earth, He was under the law of Moses, to redeem them. Why did He come? To redeem them that were under the law. Redeemed, have their sins taken away, that we might receive the adoption of sons. He made it possible for you and I and all those before the cross to have forgiveness of their sins. Look also at Galatians 1, if you will, verse 11 and 12. Paul said, I certify you, brethren. Now remember, the Spirit's the one who's actually speaking. But I certify you, I guarantee you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after man. In other words, no man made it up. No man in and of himself, not even we apostles. We didn't make it up. And then he says about himself, for I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. When did that take place? When did Paul receive this revelation? When the fullness of time came, in particular the fullness of time for him. But before that, in that we already noticed, in the fullness of time, Jesus came into the world, provided the sacrifice needed. And Paul said then later, there was another fullness of time. When? For him. He wasn't ready to obey the gospel earlier. God provided a way. God provided this servant, this man who's going to be one of the greatest servants of our Lord that's ever lived. And you know what? We can be counted among that too. Oh, we haven't suffered what Paul has. But we can be counted some of the greatest servants of our Lord too. He said, I wasn't taught it, but by revelation of Jesus Christ. It was revealed to me everything I needed to know. I don't know how it was all done. Not my business. But in some form of revelation, whether it was through words or even to the extent of showing him panoramic views of everything that took place in his ministry. I don't know. I just know it took place. So that he could be not one whit behind any of the other apostles in credentials. Paul didn't preach the creeds of the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the Essenes or the scribes or any other group of the Jews. Instead, he taught from the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, the unsearchable riches of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. Paul wasn't the one that was out of step with the law. He wasn't the one out of step with the prophets. He wasn't the one out of step with the Psalms. They were. In Romans 9, verses 6 through 8. Not as though the word of God hath taken none effect, for they are not all Israel which are of Israel. That could have easily been said on this occasion before Felix about Tertullius and those that were with him. Neither because they are the seed of it, just because they think they're, wasn't Jesus marching toward Jerusalem, toward his death in the last few days? And the Pharisees and all of those folks, they wanted the people to be quiet. And what did Jesus say? Even if you could keep them quiet, the stones would call out. They're the seeds of Abraham. They're the children of Israel, or children of God. But notice what he says. But in Isaac shall thy seed be called. Remember the patriarch. The so-called beginning of the nation of Israel. Actually, that didn't start until Moses led the people out of Egypt, in my humble opinion. That is, they which are the children of the flesh, he makes sure they understand it. Those who are the children of the flesh, they're not the children of God. They're not the true Israelites. They're not the children of the promise counted of the seed. I found a statement by a man named Roper. He said, Paul and the early Christians, now watch this, I think it's a very good statement. He said, Paul and the early Christians did not see themselves as former Jews. Isn't that interesting? But as fulfilled Jews, the true offspring of Abraham. And he looks at Galatians 3:29 to make his point. How true that was. They weren't former Jews. Paul still recognized his nation, still claimed to be a Jew, but above all, he claimed, I'm a Christian. I'm one who has fulfilled the destiny that God has for us as a nation, or had for us as a nation. They're not all Israel, which claim to be Israel. Let's come back to verse 15 and 16 next week as Paul continues his defense of the charges that have been made against him.